Welcome to another tutorial. This time we're looking at some rusted non-metallic metal, more specifically steel. The colors we're using are thermal black, dark sea blue and titanium white. First off, we're starting with a base color that's a mix of thermal black and dark sea blue. We're just making sure to make an even layer over the entire surface. In this video we will be focusing on the blade of the scythe. And as soon as we have covered the entire area, we are going to start by sketching in the highlights. So I'm mixing in a bit of titanium white into the dark sea blue and making a rather strong first light. Consistency wise, we're looking at something like a heavy layer consistency, because we want to make sure to cover pretty quickly with this one. And notice the direction of how I'm pulling the brush from the shadows and towards the highest light point. And make sure to plan out your sources of light so that you know where to place the highlights. And in this case I'm gonna be doing a pretty simple non-metallic with reflections on opposing sides, so as to give it a good strong contrast. I'm going over the sketched in lights once again, just to make sure we have an opaque layer to work with. And as you can see, you don't have to be too exact with everything, since we are going to rust this up at a later stage. And once the initial sketch lights are done, we are going to unify it. So we're mixing a darker shade, and we are glazing the transition to blend everything together a little bit. In later steps we are going to be unifying everything even more, so this is just a start to make it easier later on. Also notice at this step that I am my brush is working back and forth a little bit, and also some stippling just to break up any lines and just to trick the eye that it's more smooth than it really is. And in this step we're just going to increase the amount of white to the previous mix. So we're going to push the contrast and make like a stronger highlight. And just like before, keep in mind to the direction in which you're moving the brush. So I'm trying to push the paint towards the highlight, because if you notice where I lift up the brush, you can see where the brush will leave the most amount of pigments. So that's why we're always cautious about where we lift our brush up and in which direction we're working. And at this stage I'm starting to do some edge highlighting and picking out all the holes that are sculpted in the blade, because even for the edges we want to make like a gradual highlight, so that's why I'm starting the edge highlights at this stage. Now that that stage is done, we are going to blend that layer in with some glazes, and all I've done here is basically just thin down the highlight color used in the previous tip, and the consistency is down to dirty water basically. Think of something you'll find in a puddle. Here you have it. And just like before, I'm working a little bit more back and forth with glaze and also some stippling. And now we're pushing the contrast even further. Still not up to max highlights, but we are getting there slowly. Remember, when you're painting non-metallic, that contrast is key. You need to push it as far as you can, and just keeping the pure whites to a bare minimum. But really push the contrast, especially when you're working on a tiny model like this one from Games Workshop. It's really important to keep contrast very high. As you can see, I'm pushing the highlights towards the bottom of the edge because the light is coming from the opposite side, which means that the lights will probably catch down there. I'm not being too mathematical about this, it's just the basics. Also at this stage I'm starting to really pick out some details to make all those disgusting grooves and holes and whatnot appear a little bit more. And also continue working on the edge highlights. And just like with the layers I've been doing before, I'm working the brush from the darker parts towards the highest points of light, so that the largest amount of pigment will collect where it's supposed to collect. By now I believe most of you have picked up what's going on here. So just like previous steps, I've made a glaze of the previous highlight color, and now I'm just working the transition to soften that out. Also at this stage I'm adding some scratches just to give it a bit of a worn look. Well, it's already looking worn, the sculpture is looking worn, but to just further enhance this and to break up the surface. And it's also really good to use as a sheet if you're going for clean blends and maybe there's a blend that you're not really that happy about, but you don't maybe have all the time in the world. You can just do some scratches and your eye will be tricked. Pro tip for you. And remember not to only do scratches and lines, do also some dots and some stippling so that it doesn't get too monotonous. And what I'm doing now, well, I have no idea, but in just a second here I will start unifying everything with the glaze of a mid-tone. So what I'm looking for here is something that is grayish blue in the tone, not too bright, but pretty far from the shadow tone. So yeah, just a glaze of a mid-tone. And that's exactly where I'm working it as well, to bring some of that back, because in some areas I think the highlight tones are really starting to grow a little bit too big without having the colors. Because when doing non-metallic I've found that it's really easy to get hung up on the whole strong contrast thing. But it's also really dependent on having midtones, because it's reflective material and it's reflecting color. So if there's no color there, it's, well, it's basically just black and white. So I'm gonna have to work on some midtones as well. And now it's time to get into the proper extreme highlights, or whatever you want to call it. I'm getting really close to pure white here. Still not pure white, but it's getting very close. And now I'm just trying to talk to distract you from the fact that it's really out of focus. Here we go. I'm just trying out a new camera setup, so things are a little bit on and off with the focus here. I'm gonna work on improving that till the next video. But still, I'm working the same shapes as before, just trying to stay within the lines of what I've done before. So it's just rinse and repeat, but doing smaller surfaces with each layer and pushing the contrast with each. So as I said, I'm not all the way up to pure white because, well, I want a strong mid-tone, so the cold blue color of the dark sea blue will be visible because we want that to contrast with the rust that we're putting up later. And also here you can see that I'm really starting to pick out all the sculpted details on the blade. And still I'm working the lines to give good edge highlights, and I'm picking out some scratches as well. And a good way to make sure that the lines are nice and crisp, or as you can see, I'm working the brush back and forth. I'm starting pulling in the direction I want the line, but doing it away from the mini, and then getting gradually closer to the figure, and eventually I just let the tip, just the tip, touch the surface of the miniature. And now I'm glazing in some bit of a darker mix of the mid-tone, because still I wasn't really happy with the tone of it. I wanted more mid-tones basically, and to blend that together more with the shadows. So that's why I'm going over everything. So this is basically the process of me painting. I always go a lot of back and forth. When I feel like I'm done with a step, I just analyze what I've just done, look for anything that I want more of, or anything that I want less of. And just keep going back and forth like that. Really helps to get where I'm going. Glazy, 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 glazy. And now it's time to strengthen shadows and glaze them in properly, and also bring some definition back, especially to the sculpted details that might have been a little bit lost due to all the sketchy painting. So basically it's a darker tone down to a glaze consistency. At this point I think I'm using say a mix of maybe 2:1 dark sea blue and Tharmar black, and it's basically just a light glaze. Well, maybe a bit of a heavier glaze, and I'm dark lining a little bit the places where it's needed, and also, like I said, I'm picking out all the sculpted details and pushing some shadows like right there, underneath the highlights. This is also to create that strong contrast between the highlights and the shadows. So always keep that in mind when painting this style, that you want the strongest highlights next to the strongest shadows. So now you can see that the contrast is very strong, and there is still some mid-tone, but to me it feels like I'm gonna have to glaze a little bit more to bring the shadow and the mid-tone together and bring that all together with a highlight. So another step of unifying everything, and doing this with a glaze of pure dark sea blue. Now I think I'm starting to get to where I want it to be. I've got a strong blue tone, pretty good contrast, with a strong shadow and a very strong light as well. So now we're moving on to the next and well, sort of the second chapter of this scythe. And these are the colors that I've used to create the rust. And here you have them on the palette. I'm using a very light layer consistency, or even down to a heavy glaze consistency. I'm starting with a Rhinox hide. That will be my absolutely darkest rust. Just choosing the spots, mainly the heaviest weathered parts, where the sculpted details are. I'm just basically filling in all the holes, and then I'm starting to stipple. And further out from the source of the rust, so to speak, the further out I get, the less pressure I put on the brush with each stipple I do, or each prickle or dot or whatever. And also I'm working them a bit further apart, the further away I get from the so-called source of the rust. And since I'm using a very light consistency, I try and vary it up, so I'm not only stippling and doing lines, I also vary it up by glazing towards the source of the rust, so it creates a rather opaque layer at the absolute middle of the rust, and a bit more translucent at the ends. And now we're doing the second color, which is a mix of red leather and Rhinox hide. I can't give you any exact ratios, just mixed in whatever Rhinox hide was still on my brush, so I don't know. It doesn't really matter, it's rust, so just have fun with it, play around, and something will come out of it. But that's just the way I do it. If you want to be all mathematical, I'd say probably Rhinox hide, maybe 1 part, and the red leather, I don't know, 7, 8, whatever. Just see what works. You can always go back and forth. You're painting a Nurgle Marine, so I don't know. And same as before, I'm also doing regular brush strokes. Because I really want to make this look like the rust is creeping out, and I think the best way is to mix up the stippling and brush stroke, regular brush strokes. So for this layer I have added a tiny amount of Troll Slayer Orange to the previous mix to start giving it a proper intensity. Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing right now, but probably picking out some more color. Yep. So now I'm going in with some pure Troll Slayer Orange, or maybe not pure, but more or less. I think it's a super strong orange, but when you're looking at rust, it really does have a lot of the times it has a super intense orange look to it. So yeah, basically we are done. You can take this however far you like. You can add super much rust, like all the rust you can handle, or you can hold it back even further. To me this is pretty much the perfect amount, because I still want to have it look like steel, like sharp steel, so that's why I kept it at and from above. So this is basically the angle at which the light's gonna hit it. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you stay tuned for the next video, which will be covering either green power armor or green cloth. Haven't decided on that yet. Both will be out. So thanks again. Do hit subscribe if you want to. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye bye.